Welcome, students, to Mishnah In-Depth Keilim with Rabbi David Silber. This class is part of our Mishnah In-Depth series, a presentation of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division. This course is following the standard daily Mishnah Yomit study schedule. We are assuming that you are learning when to do mishnayot on your own independently. And for Tractate Keilim, we are coming together once a month to review, dive more in depth, and get a better understanding of Keilim. It is a pleasure learning with Rabbi Silber, who is the founder of Drisha. And with that, I'm going to pass over the mic to him.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is the third of three general discussions about Tractate Keilim. Tractate Keilim is 30 chapters long. It's the longest Mishnah that we have within the mishnayot. 30 chapters. Sometimes they're divided into three sections of 10. And they're called the first, the second, and the third gate, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra. We are familiar of that division from Tractate Nezikin, which has been divided into three different tractates, the Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra. And the same thing is true of Masechet Keilim. It's just a way to divide this rather bulky set of laws, rules, mishnayot, into more into a division of three. Each one is only 10 chapters long, etc. Okay, so in terms of Keilim, once again, Keilim is a vessel. A vessel is something that has human use and is susceptible to becoming tameh, can contract tumah. The other set of things that are similar, not identical, but similar to Keilim would be foods or ochrim. Ochrim and Keilim are similar. And the Mishnah, of course, of Tarot starts with Keilim. Later on, it will deal with ochrim. They have certain things in common that are very interesting, but they're very different. So what is a kli? That's a big question. So in the past, we've talked about a kli. A kli is something that can contract tumah, but a kli has relevance. The definition of a kli has relevance in many other areas of halacha. But one of the interesting things to think about as one is going through the mishnayot of Keilim is different definitions of kli in different areas of halacha. For example, give one simple example. What kind of kli can contract tumah? So the contraction of tumah is related to what kind of vessel we're talking about. What is it made of? There are 7 different kinds of vessels that contract tumah, based on a verse in the Torah. But the 3 main ones in Tractate Keilim are kli cheres, it's a clay vessel, kli eitz, a wooden vessel, and kli matechet, a metal vessel. What about something like a vessel made out of stone, clay avanim? Clay avanim do not contract tumah. Now, a vessel made of stone, is a vessel in different areas of halacha. For example, in terms of Shabbat, which is the main area in which the definition of kli perhaps is related to Keilim and to contracting tumah. What is a kli on Shabbat? A kli is something that has human use and is therefore not set aside, of what we call muksa. It's not muksa. A vessel made out of stone is not going to be muksa. It doesn't contract tumah. It's not a kli for the purpose of tumah, but it's most certainly a kli for the purpose of Shabbat. Or, for example, another example, the Torah says that in preparing the water to purify the one who was come in contact with a corpse, it's called mechatat. We're familiar with that as part of the ceremony of the parah adumah. V'natan olav bayim chayim el keli. The ashes of the parah adumah are placed inside a vessel which has water. That water, together with the ashes, is called mei chatat. The waters of the chatat, the waters of purification. V'natan olav mayim chayim el keli. That vessel can be a stone vessel. It doesn't have to be a wooden or a metal vessel, not at all. So a vessel made of stone is a kli, but for the purpose of tumah, it's not a kli. So I wanted to discuss briefly something about definitions of kli, and in Tractate Keilim, to look at the 3 different kinds, the main 3 kinds of vessels that can contract tumah and the differences between them. So what is a kli? A kli is something that has human use. Human use. First of all, it's something that is going to be used more than once. If it's just something that's used and discarded for the purpose of tumah, it's not considered a vessel. I was thinking about this, that actually something that's used only once, don't take this literally, but something that's used only once is much more similar to a food than a vessel. What is a food? A food is something that you use, but you consume it in its use. It's consumed. So a kli, unlike a food, is something you use more than one time. If it's used more than one time, it doesn't come under the definition of a kli. Now there's something else that comes up in the mishnayot, which is what defines a use. This comes up in your study of Keilim. You'll come across this in various mishnayot. For example, what about cosmetics? Are cosmetics a kli? So in the Mishnah, it would appear that cosmetics are considered a kli. That's cosmetics for human use. So what if you have a decorative, something decorative not for yourself, but for your animal? That, according to the Mishnah, would appear not to be considered a kli. So in other words, the question is, when I say something is being used, one of the things to look at in studying mishnayot of Keilim is definition of use. Another example, what about something that is used only on certain occasions, but not on others? For example, a menorah. A menorah is used to contain the oil or whatever, or the wicks, or the lights, candles that you're going to use. But apart from that, you never use it. But let's assume that's the case. And that's a question of temporary use. Is temporary use a use? So once again, a kli is something that you use, but in studying the mishnayot of Keilim, one thing to think about is how we define use. Is it there always to be used? Is it only on special occasions? Is it used only once? This is the question in terms of tumah v'tara. How do we define a kli? That's one area that will come up, one question that will come up in our study of Masechet Keilim. Let me now point to something else which is very important. And that is a kli, something that's a human use, is something that is, one might say, is not part of the ground. It's not part of nature. And in general, it's the case that things in the natural order are not susceptible to tumah altogether. For example, an animal. An animal cannot contract tumah. An animal can be tameh if the animal is dead. The animal dies. That's called a nevela. There it's not actually contracting tumah. There it's the source of tumah. But when the animal is alive, a living being does not contract tumah. Something the earth, the land, the mountain can't become tameh. Tumah is related to human use, being in the human province. That if it's part of nature, it's not contracting tumah. And beyond that, if it's connected to the ground, typically, it's also not mekabel tumah. Something is part of a house or a door. For this purpose, we define a house as being part of the ground, even though it's not initially part of the ground, but it's connected to the ground. So as a general rule, things connected to the ground, you'll come across this in the Mishnayot of Keilim, of course, things that are part of the ground, connected to the ground, are not susceptible to tumah. Having said that, there is one glaring exception to that rule. And the question is the exception part of a general rule or a specific exception? And that exception, which is very interesting, is found in a verse in the Torah. Many of the rules of tumah v'tara are found in chapter 11 of the book of Vayikra. And there it talks about, in chapter 11 of Vayikra, let me find this verse, chapter 11, begin with verse number 33. It says, V'kol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho, kol asher b'tocho yitma v'yoto tishboro. An earthen vessel. If something unclean falls into them, we'll come back to the earthen vessels in a couple of minutes. If it falls into an earthen vessel, everything inside it shall be unclean, and the vessel you shall break. That's called the kli cheres. Now, we'll come back to that in a few minutes when I discuss the three main vessels that are the subject of Tractate Keilim. So it says that if something falls into an earthen vessel, what's inside it becomes ritually impure, becomes tamei. 2 verses later, if anything from a nevela, that's a dead animal, falls into the kli cheres, it becomes tamei. Tanur v'chirayim yutatz tmeim heim. Utmeim yulachem, verse number 35 of chapter 11 of Vayikra. Tanur v'chirayim. And here they translate an oven or a stove. A tanur and a kira are two kinds of stoves. The stoves in the Torah are connected to the ground. Mechubar lakarka. And it says explicitly that when something falls into the stove, the tanur and kirayim, which are the subject of a whole set of mishnayot in Tractate Keilim, in the first third of Tractate Keilim, they become tamei. A tanur v'kirayim then would seem to be, on the face of it, a glaring exception to the rule that which is connected to the ground is not susceptible to tumah. And the question is why? One way to understand it is, okay, this is the Torah says, tanur v'chirayim are different. But if we want to broaden that, we might come up with the idea that, for example, some have suggested, a vessel that is dafka used when it's connected. If it's dafka used when it's connected, then even though it's connected to the ground, those vessels, since it's used specifically that way, those vessels can contract tumah. But be that as it may, this is an exception to the general rule found in the Mishnah that which is connected to the ground, or that which is connected to the house, for example, which is connected to the ground, is not susceptible to tumah. We'll come back to the kli cheres in this brief overview when I get to the three main kinds of vessels that Tractate Keilim talks about. Let me just repeat what I said in one of the earlier sessions about Keilim. And it's true of Ochim as well. Keilim and Ochim. This is an important point, not just for Tractate Keilim, but for the whole Seder Tarot, this whole long Seder Tarot, or the Mishnayot, which is the longest, by far the longest set of Mishnayot the Seder that we have. It's also the last Seder. Those who have completed the first 5, we want to complete the 6th as well. And Keilim are things that contract tumah from something else. They're not the source of tumah. Keilim and Ochim can become tamei. How do they become tamei? Typically, something can become tamei when it's not tamei in and of itself. It becomes tamei by contact with something else that is tamei. And in terms of tumah and tara, the way it works is that, for example, certain things are defined as an av hatamah. They're the source of tumah. A dead animal, certain dead rodents, or shmona shratzim. If something touches them, they are the source. That's called an av. And something that touches them becomes a rishon. A rishon. Tamei, it's a rishon. It's less severe. And if the rishon touches something else, depending what it is, that can become a sheni with tumah. So typically it's av, and rishon, and sheni. There are actually shlishi, ravi, and even the chamishi, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th stage of special things, special sacred things, etc. That's not our province now. But the kli has come in contact with a dead body, with a dead animal, with a certain rodent, etc. That's typically what happens. The Keilim, unlike Ochlim, have some special rules. One rule is that it's actually possible for a Kli to become an Avatoma, even more than an Avatoma, and that is certain kinds of vessels, metal vessels, which touched the corpse. That vessel has the same status as the corpse. That's based on a verse in the chapter in the Torah, chapter 19 of Bamidbar, that talks about corpse impurity, and the Talmud bases it on the verse Chalo Cherev Omeid, comparing the sword to the dead body itself. That's an exceptional rule, but that's not typically the situation. Typically, the situation is if a Kli touches something that's, say, an Avatoma, then it becomes a Rishon Latoma. There is a possible exception to this rule, and that is it possible for a Kli to become Tameh, not because something actually touched it, but because of a setting or a scenario where the thing itself is defined as something which is tummy in and of itself, and passes on the tumah to something else. And the answer is there is one such case, which is found in the last mishnayot of Tractate Keilim, the last chapters, and that's something called a medras, or mishkav umoshav. So mishkav umoshav means there is a rule, there is a set of people that are tameh not because they touch something else, but because they in and of themselves are tameh. And that is a category called Tumah Hayotze Migufo. There are at least 4 clear examples of that. That is a menstruant woman or a Zava. That's related to the menstruant woman, but she sees blood at a time when it's not the normal time to see it. We'll get into those details. Then there's the Zav, the male counterpart of the Zava, some kind of genital discharge, and the woman who gives birth. There's also the Mitzora, so-called leper. But leaving that, the leper has all kinds of special rules. But those tumot are tumot that's called Tumah Hayotze Migufo. It's not that the Zava or the Nida or the Yoredet touched anything. She's defined as a source of impurity. What happens? The Torah says she is Tameh, or he in the case of the Zav is Tameh. What about, the Torah says, not only is he or she Tameh, but anything they ride on, lean on, sleep on becomes tameh. That's called moshavu mishkav, mishkavu moshav, what they're sleeping on, what they're riding on. And the thing they ride on or sleep on does not become a rishon. It doesn't go down 1 degree. It's called an avatuma. So mishkav and moshav, and I'm simplifying all this, but mishkavu moshav is a tumah that is not. It happens that the Zav slept on the bed or rode on something or leaned on something, but it's not tumah you contract by touching. The bed becomes the bed of X, and that becomes the source of tumah. That's unusual. But that's a case where the Mishnah of Moshe, we might define it possibly as a Kli, and that might be a case where the Kli can actually become tameh, not because it came in contact with something else. Mishkav Moshav are a set of mishnayot towards the end of Tractate Keilim, but that's exceptional. But generally speaking, you contract tumah by touching, by being in contact with it. There's another exception to the rule, that is things inside the tent where there's a dead body. That's another exception to the rule. You can't do all the exceptions, but as a general rule, you contract tumah by touching, and generally speaking, it goes down 1 level. So that's true of Keilim. That's true of Mashkim. There are all kinds of special rules. That's not our point right now. But that's very important to remember about Tumah Keilim. Now there's something else. Let me put it this way. In Tractate Keilim, there are 7 different vessels that the Torah speaks of as possibly contracting Tumah. And this is based on verses once again in Vayikra chapter 11, talks about 7 different things that can contract tumah. But in Tractate Keilim, the main focus, apart from what I just mentioned upon the bed or the object that the zav or the zava rests upon, sleeps upon, etc., sits in, tumat mishkav u'moshav. There are 3 main vessels that the tractate deals with, and they are, first of all, earthen vessels, or I would say kli cheres. Cheres probably should be called clay. It's usually translated earthen. Kli eitz, vessels made out of wood, and kli matechet, vessels made out of metal. Those are the 3 main kinds of vessels that this tractate deals with. And each one has their own special rules. Now, of course, there are other kinds of vessels. As I mentioned before, there are stone vessels. They don't contract tumah. What about glass? The Torah doesn't speak of glass. So glass from the Torah would appear not to contract impurity, but rabbinically it certainly does contract impurity. And the question is, which is not our province, exactly the status of glass. That's not our problem. The tractate deals largely with kli cheres, kli eitz, and kli matechet. So let's go in that order. Kli cheres. Kli cheres is presented by the Mishnah and the sources in the Talmud which deal with it. It's exceptional. What's exceptional about the kli cheres is that, and it starts with chapter 11 in Vayikra, verse number 33. V'kol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho, kol asher b'tocho yitma v'yoto tishboru. If an earthen vessel in which the impure thing fell into it, all that is inside it shall become impure, and it shall be broken. So there are 2 very important points about kli cheres, 2 exceptions to kli cheres. First of all, according to the Mishnah, kli cheres can only contract impurity if something falls inside it. But if you touch the outside of a kli cheres, it does not contract impurity. This is exceptional. Normally you contract impurity by touching. When it comes to wooden vessels or metal vessels, if something touched the outside of the vessel becomes impure. That's not true of a kli cheres. A kli cheres only becomes impure if something fell inside it. And therefore the verse in chapter 19 of Bamidbar, which talks about the person who died and died inside a room or a tent, enclosed space, everything inside that space becomes tameh. That's called tumat ohel. That's a different set of mishnayot. Oh, that's separate. What about if inside the space there's a vessel made out of cheres? The Torah says it depends. If the vessel is open, it contracts impurity as if someone touched it in the inside. But if the vessel has a seal on it, samid patil alav, if it's sealed, it doesn't become impure. Because it only becomes impure by entering into the vessel. But if there's a seal on it, it's covered up. It's a cover. Then the tumah, as it were, can't get inside. That's true of a kli cheres. That's not true of any other kind of vessel. That's one exception to the rule of kli cheres. The second exception, very important exception, which is not the main province of Keilim, but comes up later. And the question is, when something becomes impure, how do you get rid of the impurity? How do you make it pure again? When it comes to a kli eitz or a kli matechet, then you simply take it to the mikveh. You put it into a mikveh, which is another tractate within Tarot, mikvahot, and you put it in the mikveh, and that the mikveh being in the water rids itself. The object rids itself of its impurity. That's true of a kli eitz. That's true of a kli matechet, but it's not true of a kli cheres. The only way to rid the kli cheres of its impurity is to break it. Oto tishboru. Now, the truth of the matter is, and this is a major subject of Tractate Keilim you will come across in your study, that the breaking of an object, ridding the object of impurity by breaking, is not confined to a kli cheres. because the Mishnah will deal with one of the big subjects of the Mishnah. What about other vessels that are broken? You break a vessel, so now we have a bunch of pieces. So those pieces retain impurity. Do they not retain impurity? A lot depends on, are the pieces still usable? Are the pieces not usable? This is one of the subjects of the mishnayot. But the point of the other vessels, which are often called the kli shetef, kli eitz, kli mateh, or a kli shetef. Lishtov means to dip something in water, to rinse it off. Because the other vessels you can take to a mikveh. But a kli cheres cannot be taken to the mikveh. That's another exception of a kli cheres. And before I mention the third possible important exception, when it comes to the stove or the oven, tanur v'chirayim, they can become impure even though they are connected to the ground. Is it only a stove or oven? Is it other objects whose use is davka when they're connected? That's a question. That's the kli cheres. So kli cheres is very, very different. Now let's get to the other two main vessels that the Mishnah will deal with, which are, of course, kli eitz and kli matechet. And here in the Mishnah, we come to a very important distinction. There are several distinctions, but I'll start with the most basic. Distinction between a wooden vessel and a metal vessel. And the difference is this. When it comes to a wooden vessel, again, going back to chapter 11 of Vayikra, and I'll read the verse. It's chapter 11 of Vayikra, verse number 32. It talks about when the 8 rodents, the shmona shratzim, who if they die, when they're living, they're not tummy. You can't contract tumor from a living animal. But the animal died. These are 8 rodents that the Torah singles out, what's called shmona shratzim. And it says, if one of them died, whatever came in contact with them, with the dead rodent of these 8, becomes tamei. Be called kli eitz or beged or osak, either from a wooden vessel or a cloth or a skin or a sack. Any such vessel. I'm sorry, that's not the verse. There it says you can dip it in, you can take it to the mikveh, dip it in water. It shall remain unclean until evening, and then it shall be clean. So the Gemara says that the verse talked about a kli eitz. It mentioned a wooden vessel. In the same verse as it mentions a sack, there's a connection, says the Gemara, as reflected in the mishnayot of Keilim. There's a connection between a sack and a wooden vessel. What do you know about a sack? What is a sack used for? To hold things. What is known in the Mishnah in the Gemara as a clay kibul. Definition of a kli for a kli eitz is something that actually contains. It's a container. Can drop. What about something that's not a container? You have a wooden knife. There's no container. Nothing is contained in the knife. It has a use, but it has no container. It is not from the Torah. It is ritually pure. It cannot contract tumah. A kli eitz can only contract tumah if it has what is known as a beit kibul. It contains something, like a sack. That's not true of a vessel, of a metal vessel. A metal vessel can contract tumah even though it has no container whatsoever. A metal knife can contract tumah from the Torah. That's known as pshut. The vessel which has no container is called the pashut. Pshute kli eitz. Pshute kli eitz from the Torah. Rabbinically is another story, but in terms of the Torah rule, pshute kli eitz cannot contract tumah. Pshute kli matechet can contract tumah. The vessel, when it comes to the metal, when we think about a vessel, we don't typically think whether it has a container or not. A vessel is something that's human. Silverware. Okay. Silverware doesn't have containers. Now, by the way, there's a question, how big a container does it have to be? A spoon is a kind of container. but it might be too small to be this. We don't think of it as a container. But a knife, a fork, don't have no containers whatsoever. But they are vessels. We use them all the time, maybe more than any other vessel. Silverware, we eat with silverware. Wasn't always the case, but we do eat with silverware. So those are metal silverware is a kli for the purpose of contracting impurity. That's not true of a kliates. Pshute kliates from the Torah cannot contract impurity. We have there a very interesting distinction between a kli matechet and the kliates. Now there's another distinction that we have in the Mishnah between a kli matechet and a kliates. Those studying the mishnayot of Keilim will come across this, and there's a very important point, and that is a very basic question. How do we define a kli? I've touched upon certain definitions of a kli, what's not a kli. It's not part of the natural order. It's not connected to the earth. It has a use, etc. But what does it mean it has a use? In other words, there's another issue, which is what is it going to be used for? For example, let's say I have an object. It's called a golem. Golem means it's sort of an unfinished object. I have a vessel, and I'm going to use it. It's a metal vessel. I plan to use it, but I'm not going to use it yet because it's a very nice vessel, but it has a little. It's not exactly. I want to sharpen it. I want to smooth it out. So, from what point does it contract tumah? It's usable now, but I'm not going to use it now because my intention is to improve it, is to make it the way I want, really the way I want it to look at the end. I plan to polish it. I plan to smooth it out, etc. What is the rule in that case? Does it contract tumah or not? So the answer is, in the Mishnah, a very interesting distinction between a wooden vessel and a metal vessel. A wooden vessel does contract tumah, even though I didn't complete it, even though I'm thinking to do more. I'm thinking to smooth it, to sand it down, but it's usable now. According to the Mishnah, such a vessel contracts tumah. That is not true of a metal vessel. A kli matechet does not contract tumah until I, the person, have completed my working on the vessel in that it suits what I want it to be, even though it's usable now. Golmei kli matechet are not makabel tumah. So that's a very important distinction between these two kinds of vessels. And I would point us now to a very, very interesting Mishnah in Tractate Keilim in chapter 25. I believe it's the last Mishnah of chapter 25. So I can get a hold of this. No, it's, yes. The very end of chapter 25 of Tractate Keilim. Last Mishnah. It's Mishnah number 9, but the end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah makes the following statement, which is very interesting and has, I think, implications, many implications. The Mishnah says, Kol ha-kelim yordim lidei tumaton b'machshava, v'yenon olin midei tumaton elo b'shinui maseh. Sha'maseh mevatel miyad ha-maseh u'miyad ha-machshava. U'machshava eina mevatelet lo miyad maseh v'lo miyad machshava. So the Mishnah says, vessels can become tameh through machshava. So there's a Mishnah later on in chapter 12 that, for example, if a person has a ring, and the ring he put on his animal. He wants the animal to walk around with the ring. Why somebody would do this, I have no idea. But he says one day, you know something? My animal Elsie's walking around with this ring, but you know what? I could wear the ring myself. It fits right on my finger. I think I'm going to take this ring and use it for myself. That's machshava. He hasn't put it on his finger yet. And it was for the animal, but he intends to put it on his finger. The Mishnah says in chapter 12 of Keilim, beginning of chapter 12, that ring now contracts tumah. That ring contracts tumah. So that's machshava. Kol hakelim yardim lidei tumatan de machshava. However, einam olim lidei tumatan elo b'shinui maaseh. In other words, let's take the opposite case. I have a ring. I say one day, you know something? The ring looks good for me, but my animal, she would look very, very good with a ring. I don't know where the ring would go. Maybe tie it around her neck or something. An animal would. I'm gonna give it to the animal. Says the Mishnah, that ring still contracts tumah. Cosmetics for animals generally do not contract tumah. Cosmetics for humans contract tumah. So I intend now to change it. I have my ring on my finger. I'm going to use it for Elsie the cow. No. When I put it on the cow, that's another story. That's an act. That's a maaseh. But machshava alone does not suffice. So this raises a general question, very interesting, a general question. The Mishnah says, and Mishnah makes a rule, maaseh mevatel miyad maaseh miyad machshava. If you actually do an act, in other words, let's say I actually, I not just bought a ring or something, I did something I took an object and I fashioned it, that it become a kli. That's called the maaseh. And of course, contracts tumah. I can eliminate that if I change the object. I take the object and I do something different with it. I do an act. That can, in fact, the thing I want to use it for now is not something that would contract tumah. That works. Maaseh mevatel miyad maaseh miyad machshava, but machshava ein mevatelet. Lo miyad maaseh lo miyad machshava. So machshava itself, thinking to do something, right? In other words, let's say, for example, my animal has a ring. I'm thinking to take it for the human, for myself. And then I change my mind again. Say, you know something? I'm not going to do that. I'll give it back to the animal. In such a case, the second machshava, the second thought, can countermand the first. So that the Mishnah actually is very interesting. The Mishnah, you see over here in this Mishnah, that there is a human dimension to what is makabel tumah or not. That's an interesting question. It's not just the objective status of something. My thought comes into play, thought and action, and the relative strengths of each. That's the end of the Mishnah in chapter 25. That the maaseh mevatel miyad maaseh miyad machshava, umachshava einam mevatelet lo miyad maaseh lo miyad machshava. So I had an initial machshava to do X, and now I want to change it. That doesn't work. That would require an act. Okay, so this is coming back to our Tractate Keilim and the three kinds of Keilim. There are, again, Kli Cheres, Kli Eitz, and Kli Matechet. Let me give you one other example of something that is unique and very interesting idea that is unique to a Kli Eitz. I talked about a Kli. A Kli is something that actually is movable. A Kli Eitz. What about if I have a Kli Eitz? I have a big bin made out of wood. It's a container, but it's very, very heavy. It has a certain size. It could contain, let's say, a certain amount, 40 sa, whatever it is. And therefore, it's not something that's going to be moved. It's called the Kli Eitz ha'osui v'nachat. It's a vessel that is there not to be moved. Is such a vessel contracting tumah or not? So when it comes to a metal vessel, it doesn't matter if it can be moved or not moved. Just like a pshute kli matechet is makabel tumah, a big vessel of a metal vessel also contracts tumah. But when it comes to a kli eitz, the kli eitz has to be something that is moved. And once again, the Gemara presumes that it's related to the verse I mentioned before, which compares the wood vessel to a sack, to a sock. So a sock, right, a container, a sock is something that you typically move. You carry it around with you. Klietz is compared to that. So the assumption is that a klietz asui l'nachat, if it's not going to be moved, too heavy to be moved, too big to be moved, it doesn't actually contract tumah. It's not considered a kli for the purpose of tumah and tara. It might be considered a kli for other areas of halacha. That's a separate question. That's unique to the klietz. Once again, comparing the klietz to a sock. Let me make one last point about the kli matechet, about the metal vessels. And the question is, what kind of metal? Now, the Torah actually, in chapter 31 of Bamidbar, in the war against Midian, and these are difficult verses over there, but they talk about different kinds of metals. And the Talmudic reading of those verses is that what's being referenced over there is, among other things, the contraction of tumah. But they only mention certain kind of metals. What about other metals? For example, what about aluminum? Can aluminum contract tumah? The Torah doesn't know from aluminum. So what is the status of aluminum? That's a big question that the moderns discuss, the poskim discuss this question. It's not mentioned. Is the Torah simply giving examples of metal? For our purposes, aluminum is metal. Well, no. Those mentioned in the Torah can contract tumah, and those not mentioned in the Torah cannot contract tumah. Let me mention one other interesting question that emerges from the Mishnah in Tractate Keilim, and this I will conclude, and that is, how do we define a metal and a wood vessel? For example, let's say you have a vessel that's made of both. Let's say you have a wood vessel which is coated with metal. So what is it? Is that a metal vessel? Because the coat of it is metal. You look at the vessel, it looks like a metal vessel. But the truth of the matter is, it's largely wood. The metal is just a coating, but the vessel is a wood vessel. That's another interesting question that comes up, and you will come across it in your study of Tractate Keilim. So I just wanted to give some kind of a very brief overview of some of the core issues that emerge from the study of Keilim. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the challenge of Tractate Keilim is that it mentions many, many, many vessels, and it's very hard to know, actually, exactly what those vessels look like. So it's good to, in studying Tractate Keilim, of course, to study with text that can explain, define what these things are, and furthermore, if they have pictures, it's even better. That's always the real challenge over here. But Tractate Keilim does raise many, many interesting questions, which are not confined to ritual impurity. For example, the Mishnah I mentioned. To what extent does human input matter? To what extent do things depend upon what we're thinking, for example, as opposed to what we do? And these are questions that come up in the Talmud, actually, not in relationship necessarily only to ritual impurity, but in relationship to many other areas of Jewish law. So again, for those who are completing the study of the Mishnah and working through this difficult tractate, one thing to think about is you're getting closer to the finish line. And yes, Tractate Seder Tarot has many challenges. But again, I urge everyone who has gotten this far to work to try to complete the sixth Seder of the Mishnah. So I wish you all well, and I wish you encourage you in your studies. Have a good day.